Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Clifford had once called Lydia his sunshine on a cloudy day. The words used to come so easily to him, dancing from his lips like honeyed verses. He would twirl her in the middle of their one-bedroom flat back then, barefoot and laughing, whispering things that melted her worries like butter on hot yam. But the man who once saw poetry in her eyes now couldn't see past her stretch marks. The woman who had once made his heart beat like talking drums now walked around him like she owed him an apology for existing. Lydia had always been full of light, the kind that didn't scream to be noticed, but just warmed wherever it stayed. But childbearing, that sacred rite of passage, had redrawn her map. Her hips widened like riverbanks after the rain, her breasts heavier, her tummy lined with the soft evidence of life she had carried. And Clifford? Clifford, who had held her through contractions and kissed her forehead as she labored, now stared at her like she was a shadow of someone he once knew. The weight of his silence became louder than thunder. He didn't need to raise his voice, his indifference clapped louder than a masquerade's drum. And the irony? It wasn't her body that changed the most. It was his heart. Each morning Lydia rose before the sun, quietly tying her wrapper, slipping her feet into worn slippers, and making breakfast while Clifford scrolled through his phone at the dining table. He no longer looked at her when she walked past. Once, when she leaned in to serve him plantain and eggs, he muttered under his breath, "Try not to bend too much, you might tear something." The word sliced through her like a hot blade on shea butter. She laughed it off, but inside, her spirit curled into itself like burnt paper. Clifford had found a new rhythm, one that did not include compliments or cuddles. Instead, he compared. "Have you seen Cynthia lately?" he asked one night without lifting his eyes from the TV. "She's had 3 kids and still looks like a model." "You people just give up after childbirth." Lydia didn't answer. What could she say? That her nights were stitched with sleepless hours rocking babies, that her dreams smelled of breast milk and Dettol, that her body had been more battlefield than temple for the past 5 years. Proverbs 12 verse 18 floated into her heart like a whisper. The words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. But Clifford's tongue knew no such wisdom. It was reckless, ruthless, and rapidly becoming unbearable. Lydia began to shrink in spirit, even as her body held on to weight she couldn't seem to shed. Not for lack of trying. She tried. She skipped meals, jogged before dawn, drank concoctions that burned her throat, but nothing seemed to please him. One evening, while helping their son complete a school project on family, the boy had drawn Lydia big and round and smiling, then drew Clifford tall and frowning. Clifford chuckled at the image and said, "At least the boy knows who eats all the food in the house." Lydia smiled for her son's sake, but inside something snapped, like a twig underfoot. That night she stood in front of their bathroom mirror, running her fingers along her belly's soft folds. She didn't see failure, she saw memory. The scar below her navel was the place her daughter had made her entrance. The stretch marks across her hips were silent lullabies, lullabies her husband would never understand. Yet Clifford, blind in his shallow gaze, continued to drown her in invisible criticisms. She cried quietly, her face turned upward under the running shower, whispering Psalm 139 verse 14 as a lifeline, "I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." But her voice was too hoarse to sound like praise. It sounded like mourning. On her way to school the following week, Lydia bumped into Julia, a new neighbor who had just moved into the flat opposite theirs. Julia was wide-hipped, soft-eyed, and loud with laughter, the kind of woman who wore bold colors and made no apologies for her figure. They struck a conversation that started with gas prices and ended with giggles over marriage drama. Julia didn't flinch when Lydia confessed her husband's cruelty. Instead, she said, men like that see with their eyelids, not their eyes. The sentence stayed with Lydia. It lingered like a scent. Over the next days, they met over Zobo in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing. Julia introduced Lydia to a women's wellness group nearby, not one obsessed with waist trainers or miracle diets, but one focused on movement and joy. Lydia attended out of curiosity, but stayed because it gave her life. They danced barefoot to Afrobeat in a dusty hall, laughed like teenagers, and held hands in prayer afterward. It was there, sweaty and smiling under a blinking bulb, that Lydia felt something shift. Her husband hadn't noticed yet. He still mocked her new routines, still talked about women on billboards, but Lydia no longer walked with her head down. No, she had begun to gather the pieces of herself he scattered with his words, one by one, like sea glass on a quiet shore. And slowly, silently, a different Lydia was being reborn. The sound of Clifford's car engine pulling into the compound no longer stirred excitement in Lydia's chest. It used to, back when her love was loud and eager, when she'd run to the door like a girl seeing her crush after midterms, wearing his favorite lip gloss even if she had nowhere else to go. But now, his keys jingling outside the door sounded more like a warning bell than music. Clifford had become a man of habit. He walked in, dropped his shoes by the door with military precision, and flung his tie over the same chair as though it were entitled to rest. Lydia stood in the kitchen that evening, stirring okra soup while listening to the creak of the chair leg he always leaned against. He didn't greet her. He didn't even clear his throat. Just scrolled through his phone, chuckling now and then. When she served his food and turned to walk away, he murmured, "You know, Toke from church just had her 4th baby. Still looks sharp. Some women know how to hold themselves." Lydia blinked once, then again. Her spoon trembled just slightly in her grip, but she said nothing. It wasn't new. Just another cut added to an already bleeding heart. Ecclesiastes 10 verse 12 drifted into her memory. Words from the mouth of the wise are gracious, but fools are consumed by their own lips. Clifford was full, not from food, but from his own ignorance. Later that night, Lydia tucked the children into bed and sat at the foot of the bed they once shared with the warmth of young love. Clifford was snoring, one arm sprawled across the bed like a man who owned the world and all its comfort. Lydia's journal lay open on her lap, her pen dancing across the page in honest strokes. Today I wore a new dress. Yellow. Clifford didn't notice. He was busy talking about someone else's wife. I'm starting to believe I became invisible the day I became his children's mother. She paused, swallowed hard, then continued. But Julia said something today that stayed with me. The problem with people who love you conditionally is that they never leave room for your becoming. They want who you were, not who you're becoming. I don't want to shrink anymore. I don't want to apologize for my softness, for my scars. I carried life twice. I should be celebrated, not compared. Her handwriting grew tighter, the words bleeding toward the edge of the paper. She closed the journal gently and whispered a prayer that didn't beg for Clifford's love anymore. Instead, she asked God for wisdom to know when to stay and when to leave, when to fight and when to fold. Isaiah 43 verse 19 glimmered in her heart like a secret promise. Behold, I will do a new thing. Now it shall spring forth. Shall ye not know it? And in that moment, Lydia knew. Something inside her was slowly, irrevocably shifting. The weeks that followed were like quiet revolutions. Clifford barely noticed them. He was too caught up in his own reflection, mistaking his stubbornness for strength. Lydia, on the other hand, started taking longer walks, not as punishment to her body, but as praise to her healing. She joined the women's circle Julia invited her to and started dancing every Tuesday. The hall wasn't much, dusty wooden floors, a rickety fan, and mismatched speakers, but within those 4 walls, Lydia rediscovered rhythm, not just in her feet, but in her soul. She danced like someone remembering joy after forgetting what it looked like. She moved like the wind had kissed her spine. Clifford laughed when she returned home sweaty and barefoot one evening. "Hope you're not trying to join Big Brother with all this new energy," he snorted. Lydia smiled softly, not bitterly. She had learned to let his jabs fall to the ground like feathers against armor. They no longer pierced. One of the dance leaders, a tall woman named Zara with salt and pepper dreadlocks, hugged her one evening and said, "There's a fire coming back into your eyes. Don't let anyone put it out." Lydia carried those words like a seed in her pocket. They grew slowly, watered by tears no one saw and laughter she thought she had lost forever. Then came the day Clifford truly saw her, but not in the way he expected. It was during a Sunday service, a bright morning where the air carried whispers of rain and redemption. Lydia had dressed in a coral lace gown, tied her gilly with bold edges, and let her skin breathe through soft makeup. She wasn't dressing for anyone but herself, reclaiming her body like stolen land. As she walked down the aisle to their usual pew, heads turned, first out of politeness, then in astonishment. Even the pastor's wife smiled at her with a knowing nod. Clifford sat stiffly, his arm brushing hers but refusing to reach for it. During testimony time, a woman from the wellness group shared how their dance ministry had helped her overcome postpartum depression. Lydia clapped. Clifford blinked. That evening, after church, he said, "You've been different lately, wearing makeup, smiling like you're hiding something." Lydia tilted her head and replied, "Maybe I'm not hiding. Maybe I'm finally stepping into the light." Clifford stared, unsure whether to scoff or confess, but Lydia didn't wait for his reply. She walked into the kitchen, humming "O Lauren" to Toby, her voice floating like incense through the cracks of their broken home. And for the first time in years, Clifford couldn't read her. Not because she was hiding, but because she was healing in a language he had refused to learn. The early days of their marriage now felt like a story someone else told, sweetened by nostalgia, distant in memory. Back then, Clifford used to hold Lydia's hand while driving, even when the traffic stalled and sweat painted their foreheads. He would glance at her during worship in church and mouth the words, "You're mine." Now, they barely spoke beyond schedules and school runs. The silence between them had evolved, no longer passive but purposeful. His silence sharp like a blade, hers soft like surrender. Lydia had mastered the art of saying nothing, not because she lacked words, but because she had learned that with Clifford, speaking was like pouring water into a basket. She'd watch him scroll through photos of other women online, his eyes gleaming with admiration he no longer reserved for her. "This is what a mother of two should look like," he once said, pointing at a filtered influencer. Lydia didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed on her daughter's math homework. But inside, her spirit sighed. There was no room left for offense, only quiet detachment. The river that once ran wild between them was now dry land. Even the children sensed it. Their son asked one evening, "Mummy, why doesn't Daddy laugh with you anymore?" Lydia forced a smile, her heart cracking like over-baked chin-chin. Proverbs 15 verse 1 floated through her chest like a hush. "A soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger." But there had been no answer, soft or loud. Only stillness, stretched like an old bedsheet between two strangers. Lydia's transformation wasn't loud or sudden. It crept up like dawn, slow and golden. With every passing week, she reintroduced herself to herself. She started journaling not just pain, but gratitude. She began dressing in colors she once avoided, her wardrobe slowly shedding the dull grays Clifford preferred. Julia had taken her to a small boutique one Saturday afternoon and said, "Buy whatever makes you feel alive." Lydia picked a mustard blouse that clung to her waist in just the right way and a blue wrapper patterned with rising suns. She wore it the next day. Clifford blinked but said nothing. That was his new ritual, pretending not to notice things he couldn't control. But the world noticed. Lydia's presence grew louder without her trying. Her students complimented her energy. Other mothers at school pickup greeted her with a different kind of warmth. One of the teachers, a young man named Felix, once said, "Ma, you always look like peace wrapped in Ankara." Lydia chuckled. She wasn't flattered, just surprised. Somewhere deep inside, she'd buried herself under Clifford's neglect, but now, piece by piece, she was rising, like Lazarus called from the tomb. The resurrection wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. Clifford watched this shift in silence. He couldn't place it, but something about Lydia's new calm unnerved him. He began to probe. "Where do you go after school these days?" "Always coming home with all this energy." Lydia shrugged, smiling faintly. "I go where I feel alive." It wasn't meant to sting, but truth often burns like hot oil on dry skin. Suspicion, like weeds in a garden, started to grow in Clifford's mind. It wasn't that Lydia had done anything wrong. She cooked, she taught, she parented, but she no longer tiptoed around his moods. That absence of fear felt like betrayal to a man who fed on control. Clifford began checking her phone, pretending to borrow it for calls. He scrolled through her gallery, saw photos from her dance class, women laughing, arms raised, sweat glistening under old ceiling fans. Lydia, front and center, radiant. In one picture, she stood beside Zara and Julia, her face glowing like sunrise on still water. Clifford stared at the photo longer than he intended. He didn't recognize this version of her. Not because she had changed overnight, but because he had stopped looking. He tossed the phone back on the bed, muttering, "So this is where all the makeup and perfume are going." Lydia didn't respond. There was no need. His voice sounded more like envy than curiosity. That evening, during dinner, he casually mentioned, "You know, men don't like women who put themselves out too much." "Modesty is still a virtue." Lydia calmly placed her spoon down and said, "Modesty doesn't mean invisibility." Clifford scoffed, but the words sat on his tongue like pepper. For the first time, he realized Lydia wasn't shrinking to fit his comfort anymore. She was expanding to reclaim the space he had long stolen from her spirit. Then came the night everything cracked open. Clifford had come home late from one of his work dinners, reeking of designer perfume Lydia didn't own. She said nothing, but her eyes followed him with a calm so unnerving he stumbled. He went into the bathroom, humming loudly, overcompensating for the guilt gnawing at his edges. Meanwhile, Lydia sat by the window, scrolling through messages in a small group chat with her dance sisters. Zara had sent a video from that evening's practice. Lydia watched herself sway to the rhythm, laughter spilling from her mouth like a hymn. She hadn't planned to smile that much. She hadn't known joy still lived in her bones. Just then, her phone buzzed with a private message from Zara. "Lydia, if you ever need a place to stay, even for a weekend, my home is open." Lydia's heart paused, not from surprise, but from recognition. She had people now, people who saw her, people who didn't see her as a faded photograph, but as a living canvas. That night, while Clifford snored in the other room, Lydia packed a small bag, not to run away, but to breathe. For once, she wanted to be in a space that didn't punish her for becoming. As she zipped the bag shut, her Bible fell to the floor and opened to Psalm 46, verse 5. "God is within her, she will not fall. God will help her at break of day." Lydia smiled. Morning was closer than she thought. The sun was barely up when Lydia slipped quietly out of the house. Her bag was light, packed with only a few clothes, her journal, and her Bible. No room for regrets. The children were with her sister for the weekend, and Clifford was still snoring, his mouth parted like a man who slept with no consequences. She didn't slam the door or leave a note. There was no drama, no shouting match, no final word meant to pierce and haunt. Lydia was not walking out to prove a point. She was walking out to find herself. Every footstep away from that house felt like a breath she'd been holding for years. The compound was still, the air crisp with the smell of dew and unfinished dreams. As she flagged down a Kiki heading toward the edge of town, her heart beat like a talking drum, loud but steady. Zara's apartment was on the third floor of an old yellow building that overlooked a small park. The moment Lydia stepped into the space, something inside her exhaled. The scent of lavender oil, soft throw pillows on the couch, and a steaming cup of ginger tea on the table. It wasn't home, but it felt like healing. Zara hugged her like someone embracing not just a friend, but a sister who had finally made it out of a burning house. "You're safe here," she whispered. Lydia smiled weakly, and for the first time in a long time, the tears that followed weren't from pain, but relief. Psalm 34 verse 18 wrapped itself around her like a warm shawl. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. The following days felt like baptism. Lydia found herself waking up before the alarm, her body lighter, not from weight loss, but from the absence of tension. She helped Zara around the apartment, read novels she had abandoned years ago, and went for long walks without anyone questioning where she was going. The women from their dance circle dropped by with fresh fruits and laughter, reminding her that solitude didn't have to mean loneliness. One evening, as they all sat on the balcony, sipping on hibiscus tea and talking about everything from politics to waist beads, Lydia laughed so hard she choked on her drink. Julia reached over, patting her back. "That's the sound we've been waiting to hear," she said. That night, Lydia stood in front of Zara's bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection with quiet curiosity. Her face still bore the lines of fatigue, but her eyes were clearer, her posture taller. She wasn't the woman Clifford picked apart daily. She was the woman who survived it. She ran her fingers along her arms, whispering to herself, "I am still here. I am still whole." Her phone buzzed with a message from Clifford. "Where are you? The kids are asking. I hope you're not trying to start something stupid." Lydia didn't reply. She closed her phone and opened her journal instead. On a fresh page, she wrote, "Freedom has no explanation. You only know it when you feel it." Her thoughts weren't consumed by bitterness. She had no time to mourn a man who grieved her body louder than he celebrated her soul. Meanwhile, Clifford found himself pacing the living room more than usual. The house felt too quiet, too still. Lydia's absence clung to the curtains, sat heavily on the couch, echoed in the clinking of spoons in the sink. He hadn't expected her to leave. Not Lydia, the soft one, the one who forgave silently, who bore his insults with grace, the one who always came back. But it had been days now, and her silence was louder than any argument. He scrolled through her Instagram, noticing photos from her dance group he had once mocked. She looked different. Not slimmer. Not made up. Just alive. The comments were filled with emojis, encouragement. "You look amazing." "Glowing." Clifford frowned. For a man who had taken her for granted, her light was now blinding. He thought of the last thing he said before falling asleep the night she left. Something about how she was always moody these days. Nothing out of the ordinary. But now that he played it back in his mind, it sounded colder than it did in the moment. He picked up his phone again, typing, deleting, typing. Finally, he sent, "Can we talk?" The message showed delivered but stayed unread. Clifford felt the first real pang of loss, not the kind that bruises ego, but the kind that gnaws at your soul when you realize someone you thought would never leave has finally learned how to. Days turned to weeks, and Lydia didn't return, not to the house, not to the silence, not to the man who couldn't see past her weight. She moved into a small flat near the school, where she taught. The landlord, a kind elderly man who reminded her of her late father, gave her a discount and welcomed her with palm wine and a grin. She set up the space with second-hand furniture and fresh curtains, and for the first time in years, she chose the color scheme. Green, yellow, and white. Hope, joy, and peace. The children began visiting on weekends, and Lydia made each visit special with games, storytelling, and laughter that echoed through the narrow hallways. She didn't ask them about Clifford. and they didn't bring him up much. One evening, while braiding her daughter's hair, the little girl asked, "Mummy, why are you happier now?" Lydia smiled and kissed her forehead. "Because I'm finally being kind to myself," she said. Later that night, she opened her Bible and stumbled upon Nehemiah 8 verse 10, "Do not grieve, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." And it was true. Her joy was no longer tied to Clifford's attention. Her worth was no longer measured in inches or approval. She had rebuilt herself, brick by brick, not to be admired, but to stand unshaken. And from the ashes of her former silence, a new voice was rising, steady, unbending, and whole. Clifford had always assumed Lydia's silence was her way of coping, her way of conceding. He mistook her endurance for weakness, and her softness for submission. It never once crossed his mind that she might leave, not until the weeks began to stretch, and her absence morphed from inconvenience to a hollow ache. He thought giving her time would make her return. But Lydia wasn't on vacation. She had left, fully and intentionally. Clifford returned from work one evening to a home that still held her scent in the pillows, but none of her warmth. Her corner of the wardrobe remained empty, her side of the bed too cold to sleep on. He scrolled through old photos of them, not the ones staged for social media, but the ones captured in real, unfiltered moments, her laughing at a burnt pot of stew, holding their newborn with tears in her eyes, napping beside him with her head on his chest. In those photos, he saw something he hadn't seen before. Not her weight, not her stretch marks, but her love. A love that had bent backward until it broke. He replayed his own words in his mind. "You've let yourself go. You should look more like other women. You're not trying hard enough." Those words now sounded like hammers hitting glass, each one cracking the mirror she had once used to see herself through his eyes. But the mirror had shattered, and in its place, she had built something stronger. One day, Clifford decided to visit Zara's apartment without calling ahead. He had no clear plan, just a need to see Lydia, to say something, anything, that might bring her back. He stood outside the apartment block, rehearsing lines that once would have made her blush. "I miss you. The kids need their mother at home. Let's fix this." But when the door opened, it wasn't Lydia who answered. It was Zara, arms folded, expression unreadable. "She's not here," she said flatly. Clifford forced a half smile. "I just wanted to talk." Zara nodded slowly, then stepped aside, letting him into the living room. The space was cozy, filled with the smell of shea butter and dried roses, but it lacked Lydia's presence. Clifford looked around and down at his feet. "Has she said anything about me?" he asked. Zara tilted her head. "She doesn't talk about you much anymore. She talks about her students, her garden, the podcast she's starting. She talks about her joy." Clifford felt a sting, like salt pressed against a wound. He sat down on the edge of the couch, unsure of his place in this new version of her story. "Did she ever say she hated me?" he asked. Zara chuckled, not cruelly, but with the kind of sympathy that carried a lesson. "Lydia never hated you. She just stopped losing herself trying to love you." Those words clung to Clifford's chest like damp cloth, heavy and unwelcome. He left without saying more, realizing for the first time that Lydia's story was moving on, with or without him in it. A week later, Lydia attended a women's retreat held by her dance group at a quiet resort in Nephora, a fictional beachside town known for its palm-lined coast and rhythmic waves. It was a weekend of rest, reflection, and release. On the second night, as they sat around a bonfire, one of the women invited Lydia to share something she had overcome. She hesitated at first, but as the flames flickered and the stars watched silently from above, she spoke, not with bitterness, but with clarity. "I was married to a man who loved the idea of me more than the reality of me. He adored my figure before childbirth, but couldn't embrace the woman who bore his children. I spent years shrinking myself emotionally, mentally, even physically, just to fit his preference, until one day I stopped. Not because I no longer loved him, but because I finally started loving myself. The women clapped softly, some wiping tears. Zara leaned in and whispered, "You need to write that down somewhere." Lydia smiled, the corners of her mouth lifting not from pride, but from peace. That night she wrote in her journal, "God didn't create me to be someone's mirror. I am the image of his beauty, whole and holy." Psalm 109 verse 14 made another appearance in her heart, not as a defense, but as a truth she had now embodied. "I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." And indeed, she was no longer afraid. Meanwhile, Clifford's life began to unravel in small, cruel increments. His printing business, once stable, took a hit when a new competitor opened down the street, offering faster delivery and better designs. His assistant quit unexpectedly, and managing orders alone proved exhausting. At home, the children were quieter during their time with him. They didn't disobey, but they didn't laugh much either. One evening, his son asked, "Why did Mummy move to a new house? Did you tell her to?" Clifford knelt to meet his gaze. "No, son. I didn't tell her to, but I also didn't give her a reason to stay." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing enough. That night, Clifford stood by the window, watching the rain beat softly against the glass. He remembered Lydia's favorite movie, her laugh during certain scenes, the way she used to rest her head on his chest during storms. But the storm outside was nothing compared to the one within him. He picked up his phone, opened Lydia's contact, typed another message, "I'm sorry. I was wrong," but hesitated. He had apologized before, casually, in moments of convenience, but this time he wanted to mean it, truly. Still, he knew that apologies were no longer currency enough to buy her return. Lydia had outgrown the space he once tried to keep her confined in, and maybe, just maybe, this time the rain had come not to wash away her pain, but to help her bloom beyond it. The sun was just beginning to rise over Elmsworth when Lydia stepped into her small backyard, bare feet brushing against cool earth. Her garden had become a sanctuary, an intimate patch of soil where she planted tomatoes, peppers, and healing. Each sprouting leaf reminded her that growth required surrender, not striving. She bent over to pull a weed from the root, her wrapper tied loosely around her waist, sweat already purling at the nape of her neck. A butterfly danced over the basil leaves, oblivious to the fact that this very space had once been choked with silence and tears. Now, laughter echoed from it during Saturday visits with her children. That morning, her daughter sat on a stool nearby, plaiting her doll's hair. "Mummy," she said thoughtfully, "I like our new house. It smells like jollof and music." Lydia chuckled, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. "It's the smell of starting over," she replied. Her daughter didn't fully understand, but she smiled anyway, satisfied. Inside, her phone buzzed. Another message from Clifford. He had been sending them daily now, not demanding, but soft, regretful, full of words he once swallowed. She read them all, but replied to none. Not out of malice, but from the knowing that peace didn't always require a conversation. Sometimes the answer was in the silence. Sometimes healing spoke louder than explanations. She whispered Psalm 126 verse 5 to herself as she watered the mint leaves. "They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. And oh, how the reaping had begun." The invitation came unexpectedly, a women's empowerment event hosted by a local radio station. One of the organizers had followed Lydia's quiet journey through the dance ministry and her recent blog posts on self-worth. The theme was reclaiming your voice, and they wanted her to speak. At first, she hesitated. Her story wasn't polished, her strength still fresh. But Zara insisted. "Your truth is enough. You don't need to sound perfect, just real." So Lydia said yes. On the day of the event, she stood before a modest crowd in a church auditorium filled with faces eager to listen. Her palms were damp, heart thudding like a talking drum, but her voice came steady. She spoke of shame wrapped in marital vows, of invisible bruises left by careless words, of the journey back to herself. I thought love meant shrinking, she said, but I've learned that any love that requires you to disappear isn't love, it's erasure. The room held its breath, hearts tethered to her truth. She ended with the scripture that had anchored her most. God is within her, she will not fall. A chorus of amens echoed. After the talk, women gathered around her like bees to honey, some crying, some silent, all grateful. One woman whispered, "You said what I've never been able to say." That night, Lydia sat on her bed, knees drawn to her chest, and cried, not from sorrow, but from the sweet relief of knowing her scars had become someone else's balm. Clifford eventually asked to meet. Not at the house, not to argue, but at a quiet cafe where they once celebrated her promotion years ago. Lydia agreed, more out of closure than curiosity. When she arrived, Clifford was already seated, a shadow of the man she once knew. Not thinner, not broken, but humbled. He stood when she entered, pulling her chair out with the awkward politeness of a man trying to rewrite history with manners. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice cautious. Lydia nodded. "You said you had something to say." Clifford swallowed hard. "I've been thinking a lot about the things I said, the way I made you feel. I was blind and unkind. I failed you." Lydia met his gaze, eyes calm. "You didn't just fail me, Clifford. You failed yourself too, because you let pride speak where love should have listened." Clifford nodded slowly, a tear sliding down his cheek. He didn't try to hold her hand. He didn't beg. He simply said, "I don't expect you to come back. I just needed to tell you that I see it now. Everything. And I'm sorry." For a moment, the past hovered between them, days laced with laughter, nights steeped in hurt. Then Lydia smiled gently. "I forgive you," she said, "but I'm no longer the woman who waited by the window. I've walked too far to turn back." Clifford nodded again. And in that quiet cafe, they parted, not as enemies, not even as strangers, but as two people who had finally faced the truth and chose peace over pride. A year later, Lydia stood at the doorway of her new classroom, surrounded by giggling pupils with chalk-covered fingers. Her life was no longer divided by his mood swings or weighed down by unmet expectations. She had poured her energy into a new project, mentoring young girls in schools, teaching them self-worth beyond their bodies, beyond validation. Each time she told her story, it became less about him and more about the strength she never knew she carried. Her dance classes still met every Tuesday. The steps were tighter now, her laughter deeper. She even started recording videos, sharing encouragement through short online devotionals for women who, like her, once forgot their light. And one rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled gently in the distance, she read a letter from a woman in another town. It ended with the words, "Because of you, I finally left a place that was killing me softly." Lydia folded the letter, eyes brimming. The rain tapping the window sounded almost like applause. She knelt beside her bed, whispering a prayer that held no request, only gratitude. "Thank you, Lord, for the breaking, for the healing, for reminding me that even in ruins there is grace." And as the clouds parted and light spilled into the room, Lydia stood tall, not just as a survivor, not just as a woman, but as a whole human being who had walked through fire and came out shining. Sometimes the people we love the most are the ones who wound us the deepest, not with fists, but with words, silence, and disregard. But know this, your worth is not tied to someone else's inability to see your beauty. You are not broken because your body has changed. You are not less because someone failed to cherish you. Growth is painful, but so is staying in a place where your light is constantly dimmed to accommodate someone else's comfort. If you find yourself in a space where your voice is silenced, your joy is questioned, and your presence feels like a burden, it might be time to choose you. Healing starts the moment you realize that peace is greater than performance, and love should never demand your disappearance. Like Lydia, may you find the courage to bloom, even in broken soil. Thank you for the gift of life, for breath that moves through our lungs, and for the quiet strength you hide in broken places. Today, I lift up every heart that has been bruised by unkindness, every soul weary from carrying love alone. Lord, remind them that they are fearfully and wonderfully made, not only in beauty, but in purpose, in power, and in promise. For the one who has forgotten how to smile, restore laughter. For the one who has been body-shamed and belittled, restore confidence. For the one who has stayed too long in a place where their light was dimmed, give them the courage to rise, to walk, to rebuild. Let your word be their anchor, your presence their refuge, and your peace their compass. We pray, Lord, that you heal every unseen scar, every silent tear, and every lonely night with the oil of joy and the balm of your love. Make every wilderness a garden, every heartbreak a testimony, and every setback a setup for glory. In the name of Jesus, the restorer of broken wings and the lifter of weary heads, we say amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.